Shalom, me homies. I'm here to read part 3 of 4 of Seeds. This book, Seeds, is a collection of excerpts from the journals of Thomas Merton. And I've already posted parts 1 and 2. I can link those in the description if you want to listen. You don't need to listen to any of this in any particular order since it is excerpts. And I will read the description of this book in case you are not familiar with Thomas Merton. Merton is often considered the most prominent Christian contemplative of the 20th century, but he was also a political activist, social visionary, and literary figure whose writings combined the candor of Thoreau and the moral vision of Gandhi. Here is a remarkably accessible introduction to his work, a collection of short, vivid excerpts arranged in 4 parts so as to parallel the journey of a seeking soul in the modern world. And the 4 parts are Real and False Selves, The World We Live In, Antidotes to Illusion, which is what I'm about to read, and then the 4th part is titled Love in Action. Okay. I'm a little warm, so I'm going to take this sweater off. Okay, hopefully I can see well enough. All right. Antidotes to Illusion. Merton believed that religious principles and practices that deepen our capacity for humility and compunction serve as allies to our real selves in their battle against the illusions of the modern world. Much of his best writing articulated the transformative power of these essential values. Truth. A sincere man is not so much one who sees the truth and manifests it as he sees it, but one who loves the truth with pure love. But truth is more than an abstraction. It lives and is embodied in men and things that are real. And the secret of sincerity is, therefore, not to be sought in a philosophical love for abstract truth, but in love for real people and real things. A love for God apprehended in the world around us. Okay, so that was excerpt 1. And it continues on the subject of truth. Here is a statement of Gandhi that sums up clearly and concisely the whole doctrine of nonviolence. The way of peace is the way of truth. Truthfulness is even more important than peacefulness. Indeed, lying is the mother of violence. A truthful man cannot long remain violent. He will perceive in the course of his research that he has no need to be violent, and he will further discover that so long as there is the slightest trace of violence in him, he will fail to find the truth he is searching for. Why can we not believe this immediately? Why do we doubt it? Why does it seem impossible? Simply because we are all, to some extent, liars. Basically, our first duty today is to remain, Basically, our first duty today is to human truth in its existential reality. And this sooner or later brings us into confrontation with system and power which seek to overwhelm truth for the sake of particular interests, perhaps rationalized as ideals. Sooner or later, this human duty presents itself in a form of crisis that cannot be evaded. At such a time, it is very good, almost essential, to have at one side others with a similar determination, and one can then be guided by a common inspiration and communion in truth. Here, true strength can be found. A completely isolated witness is much more difficult and dangerous. In the end, that too may become necessary. But in any case, we know that our only ultimate strength is in the Lord and in His Spirit, and faith must make us depend entirely on His will and providence. One must then truly be detached and free in order not to be held and impeded by anything secondary or irrelevant, which is another way of saying poverty also is our strength. We are living under a tyranny of untruth, which confirms itself in power and establishes a more and more total control over men in proportion as they conceive themselves they are resisting error. Our submission to plausible and useful lies involves us in greater and more obvious contradictions, and to hide these from ourselves we need greater and ever less plausible lies. The basic falsehood is the lie that we are totally dedicated to truth, and that we can remain dedicated to truth in a manner that is at the same time honest and exclusive, that we have the monopoly of all truth, just as our adversary of the moment has the monopoly of all error. When we then convince ourselves that we cannot preserve our purity of vision and our inner sincerity if we enter into dialogue with the enemy, for he will corrupt us with his error. We believe finally that truth cannot be preserved except by the destruction of the enemy, for since we have identified him with error, to destroy him is to destroy error. The adversary, of course, has exactly the same thoughts about us and exactly the same basic policy by which he defends the truth. He has identified us with dishonesty, insincerity, and untruth. He believes that if we are destroyed, nothing will be left but truth. Man's intelligence, however we may misuse it, is far too keen and too sure to rest for long in error. It may embrace a lie and cling to it stubbornly, believing it to be true, but it cannot find true rest in falsehood. The mind that is in love with error wears itself out with anxiety, lest its error be discovered for what it is. But the man who loves truth can already find rest in the acknowledgement of his mistakes, for that is the beginning of truth. The first step toward finding God, who is truth, is to discover the truth about myself. And if I have been in error, the first step to truth is to discover my error. A false and illusory experience of what appears to be God's action in the soul may bring with it, for a moment, a kind of interior silence, the silence of a soul that rests in an illusion. But this silence is quickly disturbed by a deep undercurrent of unrest and noise, the tension of a soul trying to hold itself in silence, when it has no truth to appease it with a superior silence, is louder than the noise of big cities and more disturbing than the movement of an army. Sincerity must be bought at a price. The humility to recognize our innumerable errors and fidelity in tireless setting them right. Tirelessly. Let me read that again. Sincerity must be bought at a price. The humility to recognize our innumerable errors and fidelity in tirelessly setting them right. The sincere man is one who has the grace to know that he may be instinctively insincere, and that even his natural sincerity may become a camouflage for irresponsibility and moral cowardice, as if it were enough to recognize the truth and do nothing about it. Our task is not suddenly to burst out into the dazzle of utter, unadulterated truth, but laboriously to reshape an accurate and honest language that will permit communication between men on all social levels, instead of multiplying a babble of esoteric and technical tongues which isolate men in their specialties. Some things are too clear to be understood, and what you think in your understanding of them is only a kind of charm, a kind of incantation in your mind concerning that thing. This is not understanding. It is something you remember. So much for definition. We always have to go back and start from the beginning and make over the definitions for ourselves again. Our thought should not merely be an answer to what someone else has just said, or what someone else might have said. Our interior word must be more than an echo of the words of someone else. There is no point in being a moon to somebody else's sun. Still less is there any justification for our being moons of one another, and hence darkness to one another, not one of us being a true sun. It may seem that a child begins by answering his parents. This is not true. What is important in the child is his primal utterance, his response to being, his own free cries and signs, his admiration. It is true that he has to learn language. Unfortunately, in learning to speak, he also learns to answer as expected. Thus, he learns more than language. He acquires, with words themselves, a kind of servitude. He gives out the words that are asked of him, that evoke a pleasant or approving response. He engineers consent. He does not merely answer, he conforms, or he resists. He is already involved in public relations. Interesting that today was No King's Day. I feel like this goes very well with what's going on in the world right now. Truth in things is their reality. In our minds, it is the conformity of our knowledge with the things known. In our words, it is the conformity of our words to what we think. In our conduct, it is the conformity of our acts to what we are supposed to be. We make ourselves real by telling the truth. There is in all visible things an invisible fecundity, a dimmed light, a meek namelessness, a hidden wholeness. This mysterious unity and integrity is wisdom, the mother of all, nature and nature ends. There is in all things an inexhaustible sweetness and purity, a silence that is a fount of action and joy. It rises up in wordless gentleness and flows out to me from the unseen roots of all created being. And that was the title of that excerpt, was the beginning of the section on silence. So we just read a bunch of excerpts about truth, and now we're on silence. It rises up in wordless gentleness, silence, and flows out to me from the unseen roots of all created being, welcoming me tenderly, saluting me with indescribable humility, This is at once my own being, my own nature, and the gift of my Creator's thought and art within me, speaking as Hagia Sophia, seeking as my sister, wisdom. Life is not to be regarded as an uninterpreted flow of words which is finally silenced by death. Its rhythm develops in silence, comes to the surface in moments of necessary expression, returns to deeper silence, culminates in a final declaration, then ascends quietly into the silence of heaven, which resounds with unending praise. Those who do not know there is another life after this one, or who cannot bring themselves to live in time as if they were meant to spend their eternity in God, resist the fruitful silence of their own being by continual noise. Even when their own tongues are still, their minds chatter without end and without meaning, or they plunge themselves into the protective noise of machines, traffic, or radios. When their own noise is momentarily exhausted, they rest in the noise of other men. How tragic it is that they who have nothing to express are continually expressing themselves, like nervous gunners, firing burst after burst of ammunition into the dark, where there is no enemy. The reason for their talk is death. Death is the enemy who seems to confront them at every moment in the deep darkness and silence of their own being. So they keep shouting at death. They confound their lives with noise. They stun their own ears with meaningless words, never discovering that their hearts are rooted in a silence that is not death, but life. They chatter themselves to death, fearing life as if it were death. Those who love their own noise are impatient of everything else. They constantly defile the silence of the forests and the mountains and the sea. They bore through silent nature in every direction with their machines, for fear that the calm world might accuse them of their own emptiness. The urgency of their swift movement seems to ignore the tranquility of nature by pretending to have a purpose. The loud plain seems for a moment to deny the reality of the clouds and of the sky, but its direction, its noise, and its pretended strength. It is pretended strength. The silence of the sky remains when the plain has gone. The tranquility of the clouds will remain when the plain has fallen apart. It is the silence of the world that is real. Our noise, our business, our purposes, and all of our fatuous statements about our purposes, our business, our noise, these are illusions. The deepest level of communication is not communication, but communion. It is wordless. It is beyond words, and it is beyond speech, and it is beyond concept. Not that we discover a new unity. We discover an older unity. My dear brothers, we are already one, but we imagine that we are not, and what we have to recover is our original unity. What we have to be is what we are. Okay, now this is moving on to the topic of solitude. Solitude. Ours is certainly a time for solitaries and hermits, but merely to reproduce the simplicity, austerity, and prayer of these primitive souls is not a complete or satisfactory answer. We must transcend them and liberate ourselves in our own way from involvement in a world that is plunging into disaster. But our world is different from theirs. Our involvement in it is more complete. Our danger is far more desperate. To to all you hermits out there, my fellow hermits. You will never feel interior solitude unless you make some conscious effort to deliver yourself from the desires and the cares and the attachments of an existence in time and in the world. Do everything you can to avoid the noise and the business of men. Keep as far away as you can from the places where they gather to cheat and to insult one another, to exploit one another, to laugh at one another, or to mock one another with their false gestures of friendship. Be glad if you can keep beyond the reach of their radios. Do not bother with their unearthly songs. Do not read their advertisements. The contemplative life certainly does not demand a self-righteous contempt for the habits and diversions of ordinary people. But nevertheless, no man who seeks liberation and light in solitude, no man who seeks spiritual freedom, can afford to yield passively to all the appeals of a society of salesmen, advertisers, and consumers. There is no doubt that life cannot be lived on a human level without certain legitimate pleasures. But to say that all the pleasures which offer themselves to us as necessities are now legitimate is quite another story. A natural pleasure is one thing. An unnatural pleasure, forced upon the satiated mind by the importunity of a salesman, is quite another. Keep your eyes clean and your ears quiet and your mind serene. Breathe God's air. Work, if you can, under his sky. But if you have to live in a city and work among machines and ride in the subways and eat in a place where the radio makes you deaf with spurious news and where the food destroys your life and the sentiments of those around you poison your heart with burdens, do not be impatient, but accept it as the love of God and as a seed of solitude planted in your soul. If you are appalled by those things, you will keep your appetite for the healing silence of recollection. But meanwhile, keep your sense of compassion for the men who have forgotten the very concept of solitude. You at least know that it exists and that it is the source of peace and joy. You can still hope for such joy. They do not even hope for it anymore. If a man does not know the value of his own loneliness, how can he respect another's solitude? It is at once our loneliness and our dignity to have an incommunicable personality that is ours alone and no one else's, and will be forever so. When human society fulfills its true function, the persons who form it grow more and more in their individual freedom and personal integrity. And the more each individual develops and discovers the secret resources of his own incommunicable personality, the more he can contribute to the life and the weal of the whole. Solitude is as necessary for society as silence is for language, and air for the lungs, and food for the body. A community that seeks to invade or destroy the spiritual solitude of the individuals who compose it is condemning itself to death by spiritual asphyxiation. I ought to know by now that God uses everything that happens to us as a means to lead me into solitude. I ought to know by now that God uses everything that happens as a means to lead me into solitude. Every creature that enters my life, every instant of my days, will be designed to wound me with the realization of the world's insufficiency until I become so detached that I will be able to find God alone in everything. Only then will all things bring me joy. Amen. Very few men are sanctified in isolation. Very few become perfect in absolute solitude. Living with other people and learning to lose ourselves in the understanding of their weakness and deficiencies can help us to become true contemplatives. For there is no better means of getting rid of the rigidity and harshness and coarseness of our ingrained egoism, which is the one insuperable obstacle to the infused light and action of the Spirit of God. Even the courageous acceptance of interior trials in utter solitude cannot altogether compensate for the work of purification accomplished in us by patience and humility in loving other men and sympathizing with their most unreasonable needs and demands. There is always a danger that hermits will only dry up and solidify in their own eccentricity. Living out of touch with other people, they tend to lose that deep sense of spiritual reality, which only pure love can give. Today, more than ever, we need to recognize that the gift of solitude is not ordered for the acquisition of strange contemplative powers, but first of all, to the recovery of one's deep self and to the renewal of the authenticity which is twisted out of shape by the pretentious routines of a disordered togetherness. What the world asks of the priests today is that he should be first of all a person who can give himself because he has a self to give. And indeed, we cannot give Christ if we have not found him. And we cannot find him if we cannot find ourselves. Do you think the way to sanctity is to lock yourself up with your prayers and your books and the meditations that please and interest your mind, to protect yourself with many walls against people you consider stupid? Do you think the way to contemplation is found in the refusal of activities and works which are necessary for the good of others, but which happen to bore and distract you? Do you imagine that you will discover God by winding yourself up in a cocoon of spiritual and aesthetic pleasures instead of renouncing all your tastes and desires and ambitions and satisfactions for the love of Christ, who will not even live within you if you cannot find him in other men? If you seek escape for its own sake and run away from the world only because it is, as it must be, intensely unpleasant, you will not find peace and you will not find solitude. If you seek solitude merely because it is what you prefer, you will never escape from the world and its selfishness. You will never have the interior freedom that will keep you really alone. You must be free and not involved. Solitude is to be preserved, not as a luxury, but as a necessity, not for perfection so much as for simple survival in the life God has given you. Hence, you must know when, how, and to whom you must say no. This involves considerable difficulty at times. You must not hurt people or want to hurt them, yet you must not placate them at the price of infidelity to higher and more essential values. People are constantly trying to use you to help them create the particular illusions by which they live. This is particularly true of the collective illusions which sometimes are accepted as ideologies. You must renounce and sacrifice the approval that is only a bribe enlisting your support of a collective illusion. You must not allow yourself to be represented as someone in whom a few of the favorite daydreams of the public have come true. You must be willing, if necessary, to become a disturbing and therefore an undesired person. Check. one who is not wanted because he upsets the general dreams. But be careful that you do not do this in the service of some other dream that is only a little less general and therefore seems to you the more real because it is more exclusive. We need to identify ourselves with those we love. We try to enter into their own souls and become what they are, thinking as they think, feeling as they feel, experiencing what they experience. But there is no true intimacy between souls who do not know how to respect one another's solitude. I cannot be united in love with a person whose very personality my love tends to obscure, to absorb, to destroy. Nor can I awaken true love in a person who is invited by my love to be drowned in the act of drowning me with love. Secrecy and solitude are values that belong to the very essence of personality. A person is a person insofar as he has a secret and is a solitude of his own that cannot be communicated to anyone else. If I love a person, I will love that which most makes him a person. The secrecy, the hiddenness, the solitude of his own individual being, which God alone can penetrate and understand. A love that breaks into the spiritual privacy of another in order to lay open all of his secrets and besiege his solitude with importunity does not love him. It seeks to destroy what is best in him and what is most intimately his. This is what it means to seek God perfectly, to withdraw from illusion and pleasure, from worldly anxieties and desires, from the works that God does not want, from a glory that is only human display, to keep my mind free from confusion in order that my liberty may be always at the disposal of His will, to entertain silence in my heart and listen for the voice of God, to cultivate an intellectual freedom from the images of created things in order to receive the secret contact of God in obscure love, to love all men as myself, to rest in humility and to find peace and withdraw from conflict and competition with other men, to turn aside from controversy and put away heavy loads of judgment and censorship and criticism and the whole burden of opinions that I have no obligation to carry, to have a will that is always ready to fold back within itself and draw all the powers of the soul down from its deepest center to rest in silent expectancy for the coming of God, poised in tranquil and effortless concentration upon the point of my dependence on Him, to gather all that I am and have all that I can possibly suffer or do or be, and abandon them all to God in the resignation of a perfect love and blind faith and pure trust in God to do His will. The true solitary does not have to run away from others. They cease to notice him because he does not share their love for the illusion. The soul that is truly solitary becomes perfectly colorless and ceases to excite either the love or the hatred of others by reason of its solitude. The true solitary can no doubt become a hated and a hunted person, but not by reason of anything that is in himself. He will only be hated if he has a divine work to do in the world, for his work will bring him into conflict with the world. His solitude, as such, creates no conflict. Solitude brings persecution only when it takes the form of a mission, and then there is something much more in it than solitude. For when the solitary finds that his solitude has taken on the character of a mission, he discovers that he has become a force that reacts on the very heart of the society in which he lives, a power that disturbs and impedes and accuses the forces of selfishness and pride, reminding others of their own need for solitude and for charity and for peace with God. Solitude is so necessary, both for society and for the individual, that when society fails to provide sufficient solitude to develop the inner life of the persons who compose it, they rebel and seek false solitudes. The world is the unquiet city of those who live for themselves and are therefore divided against one another in a struggle that cannot end, for it will go on eternally in hell. It is the city of those who are fighting for possession of limited things and for the monopoly of goods and pleasures that cannot be shared by all. But if you try to escape from this world merely by leaving the city and hiding yourself in solitude, you will only take the city with you into solitude. For the flight from the world is nothing else but the flight from self-concern. And the man who locks himself up in a private room with his own selfishness has put himself into a position where the evil within him will either possess him like a devil or drive him out of his head. That is why it is dangerous to go into solitude merely because you like to be alone. We become solitaries not when we realize how alone we are, but when we sense something of the solitude of God. This solitude isolates us from everything around us, and yet makes us all the more truly the brothers of all things. We cannot live for others until we have entered the solitude. If we try to live for them without first living entirely for God, we will risk plunging them into the abyss. We risk plunging with them all into the abyss. How many there are who have solitude and do not love it, because their solitude is without recollection. It is only loneliness. It does nothing to bring them to themselves. They are alone because in their solitude they are separated from God and from other men, and even from themselves. They are like souls wandering out of hell and finding their way by mistake into heaven, only to discover that heaven is more of a hell to them than hell itself. So it is with those who are forced into the heaven of solitude and cannot taste its joy because they know no recollection. The man who fears to be alone will never be anything but lonely, no matter how much he may surround himself with people. But the man who learns in solitude and recollection to be at peace with his own loneliness and to prefer its reality to the illusions of merely natural companionship comes to know the invisible companionship of God. Such a one is alone with God in all places. My brother, perhaps in my solitude I have become, as it were, an explorer for you, a searcher in realms which you are not able to visit, except perhaps in the company of your psychiatrist. I have been summoned to explore a desert area of man's heart in which explanations no longer suffice, and in which one learns that only experience counts. An acrid, rocky, dark land of the soul, sometimes illuminated by strange fires which men fear, and peopled by specters which men studiously avoid, except in their nightmares. And in this area I have learned that one cannot truly know hope unless he has found out how like despair hope is. Unless he has found out how like despair hope is. How much despair is like hope. how much hope is like despair. In the refractory was read a short life of Saint Benedict Joseph Lebray, who is definitely one of my favorites. The only way he could find solitude was by being the most despised person in a crowd, going so low that everybody ignored him, although he had to work to keep himself there, refusing friendship, practically never speaking, regarding everyone who treated him kindly as a benefactor, not as a friend. There is something in my nature that makes me dream of being a tramp, but from what I know of my experiences at being one, sanctity does not lie that way for me. I was already strictly a tourist even when I traveled on foot or hitched rides, and a respectable one too, in the pejorative sense of the word respectable. Even as a Trappist, I am woefully respectable, though not conventional. I have no fleas either, because I don't like fleas, and I suppose I'm not the kind that becomes sanctified by lice, although one never can tell what the future holds in store. All right, so that was the section on solitude, and now the section on prayer, meditation, and contemplation. If we really want prayer, we'll have to give it time. We must slow down to a human tempo, and we'll begin to have time to listen. And as soon as we listen to what's going on, things will begin to take shape by themselves. This is what the Zen people do. They give a great deal of time to doing whatever they need to do. That's what we have to learn when it comes to prayer. We have to give it time. What truly matters is not how to get the most out of life, but how to recollect yourself, how to recollect yourself so that you can fully give yourself. What is keeping us back from living lives of prayer? Perhaps we don't really want to pray. This is the thing we have to face. Before this, we took it for granted that we were totally dedicated to this desire for prayer. Somebody else was stopping us. It is a risky thing to pray, and the danger is that our very prayers get between God and us. The great thing in prayer is not to pray, but to go directly to God. If saying your prayers is an obstacle to prayer, cut it out. Let Jesus pray. Thank God, Jesus, in praying. Forget yourself. Enter into the prayer of Jesus. Let him pray for you. Let him pray in you. The best way to pray is stop. Let prayer pray within you, whether you know it or not. This means a deep awareness of your true inner identity. There are no levels. Any moment you can break through into the underlying unity, which is God's gift in Christ. In this end, praise praises. Thanksgiving gives thanks. Jesus prays. Openness is all. All prayer, reading, meditation, and all the activities of the monastic life are aimed at purity of heart, an unconditional and totally humble surrender to God, a total acceptance of ourselves and of our situation as willed by Him. It means the renunciation of all deluded images of ourselves, all exaggerated estimates of our own capacities in order to obey God's will as it comes to us in the difficult demands of life in its exacting truth. Purity of heart is then correlative to a new spiritual identity. The self as recognized in the context of realities willed by God. Purity of heart is the enlightened awareness of the new man, as opposed to the complex and perhaps rather disreputable fantasies of the old man. Meditation is then ordered to this new insight, this direct knowledge of the self in its higher aspect. this over so I can switch the book into my other hand. My arm's getting tight. Okay. We are going to have to create a new language of prayer. And this new language of prayer has to come out of something which transcends all our traditions and comes out of the immediacy of love. The great thing is prayer. Prayer itself. If you want a life of prayer, the way to get it is by praying. We were indoctrinated so much into means and ends that we don't realize that there is a different dimension in the life of prayer. In technology, you have this horizontal progress where you must start at one point and move to another and then another. But that is not the way to build a life of prayer. In prayer, we discover what we already have. You start where you are and you deepen what you already have. And you realize that you are already there. If you have never had any distractions, you don't know how to pray. For the secret of prayer is a hunger for God, for the vision of God, a hunger that lies far deeper than the level of language or affection. And a man whose memory and imagination are persecuting him with a crowd of useless or even evil thoughts and images may sometimes be forced to pray far better in the depths of his murdered heart than one whose mind is swimming with clear concepts and brilliant purposes and easy acts of love. This is why it is useless to get upset when you cannot shake off distractions. In the first place, you must realize that they are often unavoidable in the life of prayer. The necessity of kneeling and suffering submersion under a tidal wave of wild and inane images is one of the standard trials of the contemplative life. If you think you are obliged to stave these things off by using a book and clutching at its sentences the way a drowning man clutches at straws, you have the privilege of doing so. But if you allow your prayer to degenerate into a period of simple spiritual reading, you are losing a great deal of fruit. You would profit much more by patiently resisting distractions and learning something of your own helplessness and incapacity. And if your book merely becomes an aesthetic, far from helping your meditation, it has probably ruined it. Prayer and meditation have an important part to play in opening up new ways and new horizons. If our prayer is the expression of a deep and grace-inspired desire for newness of life, and not the mere blind attachment to what has always been familiar and safe, God will act in us and through us to renew the church by preparing in prayer what we cannot yet imagine or understand. In this way, our prayer and faith today will be oriented toward the future which we ourselves may never see fully realized on earth. The monk who is truly a man of prayer and who seriously faces the challenge of his vocation in all its depth is by that very fact exposed to existential dread. He experiences in himself the emptiness, the lack of authenticity, the quest for fidelity, the lostness of modern man. But he experiences all of this in an altogether different and deeper way than does a man in the modern world, to whom this disconcerting awareness of himself and of the world comes rather as an experience of boredom and of spiritual disorientation. The monk confronts his own humanity and that of his world at the deepest and most central point where the void seems to open out into black despair. The monk confronts this serious possibility and rejects it. As Camusian man confronts the absurd. Camus, Camus. I think he's talking about the philosopher Camus. As Camusian man confronts the absurd and transcends it by his freedom. The option of absolute despair is turned into perfect hope by the pure and humble supplication of monastic prayer. The monk faces the worst and discovers in it the hope of the best. From the darkness comes light. From death, life. From the abyss, I'm lisping. The abyss. From the abyss there comes unaccountability, the mysterious gift of the Spirit sent by God to make all things new, to transform the created and redeemed world, and to re-establish all things in Christ. This is the creative and healing work of the monk. The purest prayer is something on which it is impossible to reflect until after it is over. And when the grace is gone, we no longer seek to reflect on it because we realize that it belongs to another order of things and that it will be in some sense debased by our reflecting on it. Such prayer desires no witness, even the witness of our own souls. It seeks to keep itself entirely hidden in God. The experience remains in our spirit like a wound, like a scar that will not heal, but we do not reflect upon it. This living wound may become a source of knowledge if we are to instruct others in the ways of prayer, or else it may become a bar and an obstacle to knowledge, a seal of silence set upon the soul, closing the way to words and thoughts, so that we can say nothing of it to other men. Meditation is almost all contained in this one idea. The idea of awakening our interior self and attuning ourselves inwardly to the Holy Spirit so that we will be able to respond to His grace. In mental prayer, over the years, we must allow our interior perceptivity to be refined and purified. Perceptivity. We must attune ourselves to unexpected movements of grace, which do not fit our own preconceived ideas. Our own preconceived. Oh, my out. Sorry. We must be ready to cooperate not only with graces that console, but with graces that humiliate us. Not only with lights that exalt us, but with lights that blast out our self-complacency. Much of our coldness and dryness in prayer may well be a kind of conscious defense against grace. Without realizing it, we allow our nature to desensitize our souls so that we cannot perceive graces which we intuitively foresee may prove to be painful. Meditation is then always to be associated in practice with abandonment to the will and action of God. It goes hand in hand with self-renunciation and with obedience to the Holy Spirit. Meditation that does not seek to bring our whole being into conformity with God's will must naturally remain sterile and abstract. But any sincere interior prayer that really seeks this one all-important end, our conformity to God's will in our regard, cannot fail to be rewarded by grace. It will prove without question to be one of the most sanctifying forces in our lives. And Saint Teresa of Avila believed that no one who was faithful to the practice of meditation could possibly lose his soul. We must approach our meditation realizing that grace, mercy, and faith are not permanent, inalienable possessions which we gain by our efforts and retain as though by rights, provided that we behave ourselves. They are constantly renewed gifts. The life of grace in our hearts is renewed from moment to moment, directly and personally, by God in His love for us. Hence, the grace of meditation, in the sense of prayer of the heart, is also a special gift. It should never be taken for granted. Though we can say it is a habit, which is in some sense permanently present to us, when we have received it, yet it is never something which we can claim as though by right and use in a completely autonomous and self-determining manner according to our own good pleasure, without regard for God's will, though we can make an autonomous use of our natural gifts. The gift of prayer is inseparable from another grace, that of humility, which makes us realize that the very depths of our being and life are meaningful and real only insofar as they are oriented toward God as their source and their end. Meditation is a twofold principle that has a twofold function. First, it is supposed to give you sufficient control over your mind and memory and will enable you to recollect yourself, and withdraw from exterior things. And second, this is the real end of meditation. It teaches you to know how to become aware. It teaches you how to become aware of the presence of God. And most of all, it aims at bringing you to a state of almost constant loving attention to God and dependence on Him. A current of useless interior activity constantly surrounds and defends an illusion. I cannot find God unless I renounce this useless activity, and I cannot renounce this activity unless I let go of the illusion it defends. And I cannot get rid of an illusion unless I recognize it for an illusion. What we need is not a false peace which enables us to evade the implacable light of judgment, but the grace courageously to accept the bitter truth that is revealed to us, to abandon our inertia, our egotism, and submit entirely to the demands of the Spirit, praying earnestly for help, and giving ourselves generously to every effort asked of us by God. A method of meditation or a form of contemplation that merely produces the illusion of having arrived somewhere, of having achieved security and preserved one's familiar status by playing a part, will eventually have to be unlearned in dread. Or else we will be confirmed in the arrogance, the impenetrable self-assurance of the Pharisee. He will become impervious to the deepest truths. We will be closed to all who do not participate in our illusion. We will live good lives that are basically an authentic good. Good only as long as they permit us to remain established in our respectable, impermeable identities. The goodness of our lives depends on the security afforded by relative wealth, recreation, spiritual comfort, and a solid reputation for piety. Such goodness is preserved by routine and the habitual avoidance of serious risk, indeed, of serious challenge. By meditation, I penetrate the inmost ground of my life. By meditation, I penetrate the inmost ground of my life, seek the full understanding of God's will for me, of God's mercy to me, of my absolute dependence upon Him. But this penetration must be authentic. It must be something genuinely lived by me. This, in turn, depends on the authenticity of my whole concept of my life and of my purposes. But my life and aims tend to be artificial and authentic, as long as I am simply trying to adjust my actions to certain exterior norms of conduct that will enable me to play an approved part in the society in which I live. After all, this amounts to little more than learning a role. Sometimes methods and programs of meditation are aimed simply at this, learning to play a religious role. The idea of imitation of Christ and of the saints can degenerate into mere impersonation if it remains only exterior. When we seem to possess and use our being and natural faculties in a completely autonomous manner, as if our individual ego were the pure source and end of our own acts, then we are an illusion, and our acts, however spontaneous they may seem to be, lack spiritual meaning and authenticity. Consequently, first of all, our meditation should begin with a realization of our nothingness and helplessness in the presence of God. This need not be a mournful or discouraging experience. On the contrary, it can be deeply tranquil and joyful, since it brings us in direct contact with the source of all joy and of all life. But one reason why our meditation never gets started is perhaps that we never make this real, serious return to the center of our own nothingness before God. Hence, we never enter into the deepest reality of our relationship with Him. In other words, we meditate merely in the mind, in the imagination, or at best in the desires, considering religious truths from a detached, objective viewpoint. We do not begin by seeking to find our heart, that is, to sink into a deep awareness of the ground of our identity before God and in God. Finding our heart and recovering this awareness of our most inmost identity implies the recognition that our external everyday self is to a great extent a mask and a fabrication. It is not our true self, and indeed our true self is not easy to find. It is hidden in obscurity and nothingness, at the center where we are in direct dependence on God. But since the reality of all Christian meditation depends on this recognition, our attempt to meditate within it is in fact self-contradictory. It is like trying to walk without feet. Even the capacity to recognize our condition before God is itself a grace. We cannot always attain it at will. To learn meditation does not mean learning an artificial technique of infallibility, producing compunction and the sense of our nothingness whenever we please. On the contrary, this would be the result of violence and would be inauthentic. Meditation implies the capacity to receive this grace whenever God wishes to grant it to us, and therefore a permanent disposition to humility, attention to reality, receptivity, pliability. To learn to meditate then means to gradually get free from habitual hardness of heart, torpor, grossness of mind, due to arrogance and non-acceptance of simple reality, or resistance to the concrete demands of God's will. If in fact our hearts remain apparently indifferent and cold, and we find it morally impossible to begin meditating in this way, then we should at least realize that this coldness is itself a sign of our need and our helplessness. We should take it accordingly as a motive for prayer. We might also reflect that perhaps without meaning to, we have fallen into a spirit of routine and are not able to see how to recover our spontaneity without God's grace, for which we must wait patiently, but with earnest desire. This waiting itself will be for us a school of humility. The worst thing that can happen to a person who is already divided up into a dozen different compartments is to seal off yet another compartment and tell him that this one is more important than all of the others, and that he must henceforth exercise a special care in keeping it separate from them. That is what tends to happen when contemplation is unwisely thrust without warning upon the bewilderment and distraction of Western man. The Eastern traditions have the advantage of disposing the person more naturally for contemplation. The first thing that you have to do before you start thinking about such a thing as contemplation is to try to recover your basic natural unity, to reintegrate your compartmentalized being into a coordinated and simple whole, and learn to live as a unified human. This means that you have to bring back together the fragments of your distracted existence so that when you say I, there is really someone present to support the pronoun you have uttered. The most usual entrance to contemplation is through a desert of aridity, in which, although you see nothing and feel nothing and apprehend nothing and are conscious only of a certain interior suffering and anxiety, yet you are drawn and held in the darkness and dryness, because it is the only place in which you find any kind of stability and peace. As you progress, you learn to rest in this arid quietude, and the assurance of a comforting and mighty presence at the heart of this experience grows, and you move more and more until you gradually realize that it is God revealing himself to you in a light that is painful to your nature and to all of its faculties, because it is infinitely above them and because its purity is at war with your own selfishness and darkness and imperfection. Contemplative prayer is, in a way, simply the preference for the desert, for emptiness, for poverty. One has begun to know the meaning of contemplation when he intuitively and spontaneously seeks the dark and unknown path of aridity in preference to every other way. The contemplative is one who would rather not know than know, rather not enjoy than enjoy, rather not have proof that God loves him, rather not have proof that God loves him. He accepts the love of God on faith, in defiance of all apparent evidence. This is the necessary condition, and a very paradoxical condition, for the mystical experience of the reality of God's presence and of his love for us. Only when we are able to let go of everything within us, all desire to see, to know, to taste, to experience the presence of God, do we truly become able to experience the presence of God with the overwhelming conviction and reality that revolutionize our entire inner life. The contemplative life isn't something objective that is there and to which, after fumbling around, you finally gain access. The contemplative life is a dimension in our subjective existence. Discovering the contemplative life is a new self-discovery. One might say it is the flowering of a deeper identity on an entirely different plane from a mere psychological discovery, a paradoxical new identity that is found only in loss of self. To find oneself by losing oneself, that is part of contemplation. Remember the gospel. He who would save his life must lose it. Contemplation is the highest expression of man's intellectual and spiritual life. It is the life itself, fully awake, fully active, fully aware that it is alive. It is spiritual wonder. It is spontaneous awe at the sacredness of life, of being. It is gratitude for life, for awareness, and for being. It is a vivid realization of the fact that life and being in us proceed from an invisible, transcendent source. It is, above all, awareness of the reality of that source. It knows the source, obscurely and inexplicably, but with a certitude that goes both beyond reason and beyond simple faith. Contemplation is not and cannot be a function of the external self. There is an irreducible opposition between the deep transcendent self that awakens only in contemplation and the superficial external self which we commonly identify with the first person singular. We must remember that this superficial I is not our real self. It is our individuality and our empirical self, but it is not truly the hidden and mysterious person in whom we subsist before the eyes of God. The I that works in the world thinks about itself, observes its own reactions, it talks about itself. It is not the true I. It is not the true I that has been It is not the true I that has been united to God in Christ. It is at best the vesture, the mask, the disguise of the mysterious and unknown self, whom most of us never discover until we are dead. Our external superficial self is not eternal, not spiritual, far from it. This self is doomed to disappear as completely as smoke from a chimney. It is utterly frail and evanescent. That's a good word. Evanescence. It is utterly frail and evanescent. Contemplation is precisely the awareness that this I is really not I, and the awakening of the unknown I that is beyond observation and reflection and is incapable of commenting upon itself. The contemplative way is in no sense a deliberate technique of self-emptying in order to produce an esoteric experience. It is the paradoxical response to an almost incomprehensible call from God, drawing us into solitude, plunging us into darkness and silence, not to withdraw and protect us from peril, but to bring us safely through untold dangers by a miracle of love and power. The contemplative way is in fact not a way. Christ alone is the way, and he is invisible. The desert of contemplation is simply a metaphor to explain the state of emptiness which we experience when we have left all ways, forgotten ourselves, and taken the invisible Christ as our way. One of the first things to learn if you want to be contemplative is how to mind your own business. Nothing is more suspicious in a man who seems holy than impatient desire to reform other men. Nothing is more suspicious in a man who seems holy than an impatient desire to reform other men. A serious obstacle to recollection is the mania for directing those you have not been appointed to direct, reforming those you have not been asked to reform, correcting those over whom you have no jurisdiction. How can you do these things and keep your mind at rest? Renounce this futile concern with other men's affairs. Pay as little attention as you can to the faults of other people, and none at all to their natural defects and eccentricities. The contemplative life must provide an area, a space of liberty, of silence, in which possibilities are allowed to surface and new choices beyond routine choice become manifest. It should create a new experience of time, not as stopgap stillness, but as temps variage, not a blank to be filled, or an untouched space to be conquered and violated, but a space which can enjoy its own potentialities and hopes, and its own presence to itself, one's own time, but not dominated by one's own ego and its demands, hence open to others, compassionate time, rooted in the sense of common illusion and in criticism of it. The most dangerous man in the world is a contemplative who is guided by nobody. He trusts his own visions. He obeys the attractions of an interior voice, but will not listen to other men. He identifies the will of God with anything that makes him feel, within his own heart a big, warm, sweet interior glow. The sweeter and the warmer the feeling is, the more he is convinced of his own infallibility. And if the sheer force of his own self-confidence communicates itself to other people and gives them the impression that he is really a saint, such a man can wreck a whole city or a religious order or even a nation. The world is covered with scars that have been left in its flesh by visionaries like these. Wow. However, very often these people are nothing more than harmless bores. They have wandered into a spiritual blind alley, and there they rest in a snug little nest of private emotions. No one else can really bring himself either to envy or admire them, because even those who know nothing of the spiritual life can somehow sense that these are men who have cheated themselves out of reality and have come to be content with a fake. They seem to be happy, but there is nothing inspiring or contagious about their happiness. They seem to be at peace, but their peace is hollow and restless. They have much to say, and everything they say is a message with a capital M, and yet it convinces nobody, because they have preferred pleasure and emotion to the austere sacrifices imposed by genuine faith. Their souls have become stagnant. The flame of true contemplation has gone out. When you are led by God into the darkness where contemplation is found, you are not able to rest in the false sweetness of your own will. The fake interior satisfaction of self-complacency and absolute confidence in your own judgment will never be able to deceive you entirely. It will make you slightly sick, and you will be forced by a vague sense of interior nausea to gas yourself open and let the poison out. When the next step comes, you do not take the step. You do not know the transition. You do not fall into anything. You do not go anywhere. And you do not know the way by which you got there or the way by which you come back afterward. You are certainly not lost. You do not fly. There is no space, or there is all space. It makes no difference. The next step is not a step. You are not transported from one degree to another. What happens is that the separate entity that is you apparently disappears, and nothing seems to be left but a pure freedom, indistinguishable from infinite freedom. Love identified with love. Not two loves, one waiting for the other, striving for the other, seeking for the other, but love, loving in freedom. Would you call this experience? I think you might say this only becomes an experience in a man's memory. Otherwise, it seems wrong to speak of it as something that happened. Because things that happen have to happen to some subject, and experiences have to be experienced by someone. But here, the subject of any divided or limited or creature experience seems to have vanished. You are not you. You are fruition. If you like, you do not have an experience. You become experience. But that is entirely different, because you no longer exist in such a way that you can reflect on yourself or see yourself having an experience or judge what is going on. If it can be said that something is going on that is not eternal and unchanging, and an activity so tremendous that it is indefinitely still. Infinitely, not indefinitely. Well, infinitely. And here all adjectives fall to pieces. Words become stupid. Everything you say is misleading, unless you list every possible experience and say, that is not what it is. That is not what I am talking about. Metaphor has now become hopeless altogether. Talk about darkness if you must, but the thought of darkness is already too dense and too coarse. Anyway, it is no longer darkness. You can speak of emptiness, but that makes you think of floating around space, and this is nothing spatial. The way to contemplation is an obscurity so obscure that it is no longer even dramatic. There is nothing in it that can be grasped and cherished as heroic or even unusual. And so, for a contemplative, there is supreme value in the ordinary everyday routine of work, poverty, hardship, and monotony that characterize the lives of all the poor, uninteresting, and forgotten people in the world. The surest asceticism is the bitter insecurity in labor and non-entity of the really poor. To be utterly dependent on other people, to be ignored and despised and forgotten, to know little of respectability or comfort, to take orders and work hard for little or no money. Wipe out, sorry. Okay. It is a hard school, and one which most pious people do their best to avoid. No one teaches contemplation except God, who gives it. The best you can do is write something or say something that will serve as an occasion for someone else to realize what God wants of him. The contemplative life has nothing to tell you except to reassure you and say that if you dare to penetrate your own silence and dare to advance without fear into the solitude of your own heart and risk the sharing of that solitude with the lonely other who seeks God through you and with you, then you will truly recover the light and the capacity to understand what is beyond words and beyond explanations because it is too close to be explained. It is the intimate union in the depths of your own heart, of God's Spirit and your own secret inmost self, so that you and He are in truth one spirit. All right. The next section is monasticism. Man has an instinctive need for harmony and peace, for tranquility, order, and meaning. None of those seem to be the most salient characteristics of modern society. A book written in a monastery where the traditions and rites of a more contemplative age are still alive and still practiced could not help but remind men that there had once existed a more leisurely and more spiritual way of life, and that this was the way of their ancestors. Thus, even into the confused pattern of Western life is woven a certain memory of contemplation. It is a memory so vague and so remote that it is hardly understood, and yet it can awaken the hope of recovering inner peace. In this hope, modern man can perhaps entertain, for a brief time, the dream of a contemplative life and of a higher spiritual state of quiet, of rest, of untroubled joy. But a sense of self-deception and guilt immediately awakens a reaction of despair, disgust, a rejection of the dream, and a commitment to total activism. We must face the fact that the mere thought of contemplation is one which deeply troubles the person who takes it seriously. It is so contrary to the modern way of life, so apparently alien, so seemingly impossible, that the modern man who even considers it finds at first that his whole being rebels against it. The monastic life is in a certain sense scandalous. The monk is precisely a man who has no specific task. He is liberated from the routines and servitudes of organized human activity in order to be free. Free of what? Free to see, free to praise, free to understand, free to love. This ideal is easy to describe. much more difficult to realize. Obviously, in reality, the life of a monastic community has many tasks and even certain organized routines so that the monk, in his own little world, lives a social life like everybody else. This social life can become complicated and overactive, and he suffers the same temptations to evasion, to meaninglessness, to bad faith, to restless agitation. But the purpose of the monastic life is to enable a man to face reality in all its naked, disconcerting, possibly drab and disappointing factuality, without excuses, without useless explanations, and without subterfuges. The literature of the Desert Fathers is iconography rather than character study. It shows us the spiritual radiation of men who are outside history, men who have taken history to themselves and transcend it, who render it transparent, thus showing its inner and secret dimensions. The monastic life, then, is not a mere refusal of history, but for this fruit to mature, there must be true sanctity, and truly monastic sanctity. As long as a solitary life is systematically played down, discouraged, and even forbidden, I do not think that even the cenobitic life, I don't know what that word means, will bear its proper fruits. Like a synagogue, but with a C. Cenobitic. I guess that just means monastic, I don't know. This is an extreme and radical view, implying the rejection of culture. In order to elevate it also to the transparent level, the frank adoption of a life lacking in rational measure as against the moderation and good sense of merely ethical norms. But once again, when we consider our monks in the concrete, who of them is able to do this without breaking down? One of his, Father Paul Evdokimov's, most impressive phrases, one goes into the desert to vomit up the interior phantom, the doubter, the double. It is the monk's office to do this for himself and for others, since others are not in a position to do it. The ascese of solitude is ascesis, ascesis, ascesis. The ascesis of solitude is then a deep therapy which has uncovered the aesthetic archetype in man. I guess that's like saying the aestheticness of solitude. The ascesis of solitude then is a deep therapy which has uncovered the aesthetic archetype in man. But again, the risk is enormous. When one considers monks in the concrete, one finds them dangerously bound to their double, incapable of vomiting him out. It is precisely this phantom, this impostor, that dictates the pseudo-asceticism of the contemplative posturing of the misfits. It is certainly true, then, that this special perspective necessarily implies that the monk will be in some sense critical of the world, of its routines, its confusions, and its sometimes tragic failures to provide other men with lives that are fully sane and human. The monk can and must be open to the world, but at the same time he must be able to get along without a naive and uncritical secularity which blindly assumes that everything in the world is at every moment getting better and better for everybody. This critical balance is no doubt difficult to achieve, but it is something which the monk owes to the world. For the monastic life has a certain prophetic character about it. Not that the monk should be able to tell what is about to happen in the kingdom of God, but in the sense that he is a living witness to the freedom of the sons of God and to the essential difference between the freedom and the spirit of the world. While admitting that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, the monk does not forget that when the Son of God came into the world, it did not receive him because it could not. It was bound to oppose and reject him. Sorry to lose my voice. Oh, okay. I'm pretty sure this is almost finished. The monk is not defined by his task, his usefulness. In a certain sense, he is supposed to be useless, because his mission is not to do this or that job, but to be a man of God. He does not live in order to exercise a specific function. His business is life itself. This means that monasticism aims at the cultivation of a certain quality of life, a level of awareness, a depth of consciousness, an area of transcendence and of adoration which are not usually possible in an active secular existence. This does not imply that the secular level is entirely godless or reprobate, or that there can be no real awareness. Of God in the world. Nor does it mean that worldly life is to be considered wicked or even inferior. But it does mean that more immersion and total absorption in worldly business end by robbing one of a certain necessary perspective. The monk seeks to be free from what William Faulkner called the same frantic steeplechase toward nothing, which is the essence of worldliness everywhere. An abbey is an earthly paradise because it is an earthly purgatory. We are living through the greatest crisis in the history of man, and this crisis is centered precisely in the country that has made a fetish out of action and has lost or perhaps never had the sense of contemplation. Far from being irrelevant, prayer, meditation, and contemplation are of the utmost importance in America today. Unfortunately, it must be admitted that the official contemplative life as it is lived in our monasteries needs a great deal of rethinking, because it is still too closely identified with patterns of thought that were accepted 500 years ago, but which are completely strange to modern man. The whole illusion of a separate holy existence is a dream. Not that I question the reality of vocation or of my monastic life, but the conception of separation from the world that we have in the monastery too easily presents itself as a complete illusion. The illusion that by making vows, we become a different species of being pseudo-angels, spiritual men, men of interior life, what have you. Thank God that I am like other men and that I am only a man among others. If there is a problem for Christianity today, it is the problem of the identification of Christendom with certain forms of culture and society, certain political and social structures, which for 1500 years have dominated Europe and the West. The first monks were men who already in the 4th century began to protest. The first monks were men who already in the 4th century began to protest against this identification as a falsehood and a servitude. 1500 years of European Christendom, in spite of certain definite achievements, have not been an unequivocal glory for Christendom. The time has come for judgment to be passed on this history. I can rejoice in this fact, believing that the judgment will be a liberation of the Christian faith from servitude to an involvement in the structures of the secular world. And that is why I think certain forms of Christian optimism are to be taken with reservations, insofar as they lack the genuine eschatological consciousness of the Christian vision, and concentrate upon the naive hope of merely temporal achievements, churches on the moon. The Desert Fathers did in fact meet the problems of their time, in the sense that they were among the few who were ahead of their time, and opened the way for the development of a new man and a new society. They represent what modern philosophers, Jaspers and Mumford, call the emergence of axial man, the forerunner of the modern personalist man. The 18th and 19th centuries, with their pragmatic individualism, degraded and corrupted the psychological heritage of axial man with its debt to the Desert Fathers and other contemplatives, and prepared the way for the great regression to the herd mentality that is taking place now. Faith. The man who does not permit his spirit to be beaten down and upset by dryness and helplessness, but who lets God lead him peacefully through the wilderness, and desires no other support or guidance than that of pure faith and trust in God alone, will be brought to the promised land. The religious problem of the 20th century is not understandable if we regard it only as a problem of unbelievers and of atheists. It is also and perhaps chiefly a problem of believers. The faith that has grown cold is not only the faith that the unbeliever has lost, but the faith that the believer has kept. This faith has too often become rigid, or complex, sentimental, foolish, or impertinent. It has lost itself in imaginings and unrealities, dispersed itself in pontifical and organizational routines, or evaporated in activism and loose talk. The most hopeful sign of religious renewal is the authentic sincerity and openness with which some believers are beginning to recognize this. At the very moment when it would seem that they had to gather for a fanatical last-ditch stand, these believers are dropping their defensiveness, their defiance, and their mistrust. They are realizing that a faith that is afraid of other people is no faith at all. Absurdity is the anguish of realizing that underneath the apparently logical pattern of a more or less well-organized and rational life, there lies an abyss of irrationality, confusion, pointlessness, and indeed of apparent chaos. This is what immediately impresses itself upon the man who has renounced diversion. It cannot be otherwise, for in renouncing diversions, he renounces the seemingly harmless pleasure of building a tight, self-oriented illusion about himself and his little world. He accepts the difficulty of facing the million little things in life which are incomprehensible, instead of simply ignoring them. Incidentally, it is only when the apparent absurdity of life is faced in all truth that faith really becomes possible. Otherwise, faith tends to be a kind of diversion, a spiritual amusement, in which one gathers up accepted conventional formulas and arranges them in the approved mental patterns without bothering to investigate their meaning or asking if they have any practical consequences in one's life. Self-confidence is a precious natural gift, a sign of health, but it is not the same thing as faith. Faith is much deeper, and it must be deep enough to subsist when we are weak, when we are sick, when our self-confidence is gone, when our self-respect is gone. I do not mean that faith only functions when we are otherwise in a state of collapse, but true faith must be able to go on even when everything else is taken away from us. Only a humble man is able to accept faith on these terms, so completely without reservation that he is glad of it in its pure state, and welcomes it happily, even when nothing else comes with it, and when everything else is taken away. For some faithful and unbelievers too, faith seems to be a kind of drunkenness, and an anesthetic that keeps you from realizing and believing that anything can ever go wrong. Such faith can be immersed in a world of violence and make no objection. The violence is perfectly all right. It is quite normal, unless, of course, it happens to be exercised by black men. Then it must be put down instantly by superior force. The drunkenness of this kind of faith, whether it is a religious message or merely in a political ideology, enables us to go through life without seeing that our own violence is a disaster, and that the overwhelming force by which we seek to assert ourselves and our own self-interest may be our ruin. Is faith a narcotic dream in a world of heavily armed robbers, or is it an awakening? Is faith a convenient nightmare in which we are attacked and obliged to destroy our attackers? What if we awaken to discover that we are the robbers, and our destruction comes from the root of hate in ourselves? How many people there are in the world of today who have lost their minds, along with the vain hopes and illusions of their childhood? Minds. Faith. There's a lot of people that have lost their minds too. I could be one of them. Sometimes you have to lose your mind to find your heart. Usually. How many people there are in the world of today who have lost their faith, along with the vain hopes of illusions of their childhood? What they called faith was just one among all the other illusions. They placed all their hope in a certain sense of spiritual peace, of comfort, of interior equilibrium, of self-respect. Then, when they began to struggle with the real difficulties and burdens of mature life, when they became aware of their own weakness, they lost their peace. They let go of their precious self-respect, and it became impossible for them to believe. That is to say, it became impossible for them to comfort themselves, to reassure themselves with the images and concepts that they found reassuring in childhood. Place no hope in the feeling of assurance and spiritual comfort. You may well have to get along without this. Indeed, the truth that many people never understand until it is too late is that the more you try to avoid suffering, the more you suffer, because smaller and more insignificant things begin to torture you in proportion to your fear of being hurt. The one who does most to avoid suffering is in the end the one who suffers the most, and his suffering comes to him from things so little and so trivial that one can say that it is no longer objective at all. It is his own existence, his own being, that is at once the subject and the source of his pain, and his very existence and consciousness is his greatest torture. This is another of the great perversions by which the devil uses our philosophies to turn our whole nature inside out and eviscerate all of our capacities for good, turning them against ourselves. In getting the best of our secret attachments, one which cannot see because they are principles of spiritual blindness, our own initiative is almost always useless. We need to leave the initiative in the hands of God, working in our souls either directly in the night of aridity and suffering or through events and other men. This is where so many holy people break down and go to pieces. As soon as they reach the point where they can no longer see the way and guide themselves by their own light, they refuse to go any further. They have no confidence in anyone except themselves. Their faith is largely an emotional illusion. It is rooted in their feelings, in their physique, in their temperament. It is a kind of natural optimism that is stimulated by moral activity and warmed by the approval of other men. If people oppose it, this kind of faith will find refuge in self-complacency. But when the time comes to enter the darkness in which we are naked and helpless and alone, in which we see the insufficiency of our greatest strength and the hollowness of our strongest virtues, in which we have nothing of our own to rely on, and nothing in our nature to support us, and nothing in the world to guide us or give us light, then we find out whether or not we live by faith. It is in this darkness, when there is nothing left in us that can please or comfort our own minds, when we seem to be useless and worthy of all contempt, when we seem to have failed, when we seem to have been destroyed and devoured, it is then that the deep and secret selfishness that is too close for us to identify is stripped away from our souls. It is in this darkness that we find true liberty. It is in this abandonment that we are made strong. This is the night which empties us and makes us pure. I'm not done, but I am cold. Okay. That's better. The dark night of the soul. That's what the world is going through right now. There's light on the other side. We're detoxing. All right. Faith is primarily intellectual assent. But if it were only that and nothing more, if it were only the argument of what does not appear, it would not be complete. It has to be something more than assent of mind. It is also a grasp, a contact, a communion of wills, the substance of things hoped for. By faith, one not only consents to propositions revealed by God, one not only attains to truth in a way that intelligence and reason alone cannot do, but one assents to God himself. One receives God. One says yes, not merely to a statement about God, but to the invisible, infinite God himself. Faith, then, is not just the grim determination to cling to a certain form of words, no matter what may happen, though we must certainly be prepared to defend our creed with our life. But above all, faith is the opening of the inward eye, the eye of the heart, to be filled with the presence of divine light. If we are not humble, we tend to demand that faith must also bring with it good health, peace, good luck, success in business, popularity, world peace, every other good thing we can imagine. And it is true that God can give us all of these good things. if he wants to, but they are of no importance compared with faith, which is essential. If we insist on other things as the price of our believing, we tend by that very fact to undermine our own belief. I do not think it would be an act of mercy on God's part simply to let us get away with this. Be careful of every vain hope. It is in reality a temptation to despair. It may seem very real, very substantial. You may come to depend far too much on its apparent solidity of what you think is soon to be yours. You may make your whole spiritual life, your very faith itself, dependent on this illusory promise. Then, when it dissolves into air, everything else dissolves along with it. Your whole spiritual life slips away between your fingers and you are left with nothing. In reality, this could be a good thing, and we should be able to regard it as a good thing if only we could fall back on the substantiality of pure and obscure faith, which cannot deceive us. But our faith is weak. Indeed, too often the weakest thing about our faith is the illusion that our faith is strong, when the strength we feel is only the intensity of emotion of our sentiment, which has nothing to do with real faith. Charity. Charity is a love for God which respects the need that other men have for him. Therefore, charity alone can give us the power and the delicacy to love others without defiling their loneliness, which is their need and their salvation. This is the greatest paradox of charity, that unless we are selfish enough to desire to become perfectly unselfish, we have not charity. And unless we love ourselves enough to seek perfect happiness in the total forgetfulness of ourselves, we will never find happiness. Charity is a self-interest which seeks fulfillment in the renunciation of all of its interests. Charity is created and strengthened within us by the action of the Holy Spirit, most of all in times of trial and sacrifice, because it is then that we are pressed and compelled by circumstances to make heroic choices that confirm our union with Christ and teach us to know him as he is. For Christ without the cross is not our Christ. True, he is now the risen Christ. He knows no suffering. He dieth now no more. But he has wounds. Even though they be glorious, they are wounds. It is easy enough to tell the poor to accept their poverty as God's will when you yourself have warm clothes and plenty of food and medical care and a roof over your head and no worry about the rent. But if you want them to believe you, try to share some of their poverty and see if you accept it as God's will yourself. In the economy of divine charity, we have only as much as we give, but we are called upon to give as much as we have, and more, as much as we are. So the measure of our love is theoretically without limits. The more we desire to give ourselves in charity, the more charity we will have to give. And the more we give, the more truly we shall be. For the Lord endows us with a being proportionate to the giving for which we are destined. The Lord endows us with a being proportionate to the giving for which we are destined. You have a destiny. Charity is the life and the riches of his kingdom. And those are greatest in it who are least. That is, who have kept nothing for themselves, retaining nothing but their desire to give. He who tries to retain what he is and what he has and keep it for himself buries his talents. When the Lord comes in judgment, this servant is found to have no more than he had at the beginning. But those who have made themselves less by giving away what they had shall be found both to be and to have more than they had. And to him who has most shall be given that which the unprofitable servant kept for himself. Humility. The value of our activity depends almost entirely on the humility to accept ourselves as we are. The reason why we do things so badly is that we are not content to do what we can. We insist on doing what is not asked of us because we want to taste the success that belongs to somebody else. We never discover what it is like to make a success of our own work because we do not want to undertake any work that is merely proportionate to our powers. Who is willing to be satisfied with a job that expresses all his limitations? He will accept such work only as a means of livelihood while he waits to discover true vocation. The world is full of unsuccessful businessmen who still secretly believe they were meant to be artists or writers or actors in the movies. A man who is not stripped and poor and naked within his own soul will unconsciously tend to do the works he has to do for his own sake rather than for the glory of God. He will be virtuous, not because he loves God's will, but because he wants to admire his own virtues. But every moment of the day will bring him some frustration that will make him bitter and impatient, and in his impatience, he will be discovered. He has planned to do spectacular things. He cannot conceive himself without a halo. And when the events of his daily life keep reminding him of his own insignificance and mediocrity, he is ashamed, and his pride refuses to swallow a truth at which no sane man should be surprised. We cannot avoid missing the point of almost everything we do, but what of it? Life is not a matter of getting something out of everything. Life itself is imperfect. All created beings begin to die as soon as they begin to live, and no one expects any one of them to become absolutely perfect, still less to stay that way. Each individual thing is only a sketch of the specific perfection planned for its kind. Why should we ask it to be anything more? If we are too anxious to find absolute perfection in created things, we cease to look for perfection where alone it can be found, in God. The secret of the imperfection of all things, of their inconsistency, their fragility, their falling into nothingness, is that they are only a shadowy expression of the one being from whom they receive their being. If they were absolutely perfect and changeless in themselves, they would fail in their vocation, which is to give glory to God by their contingency. One who is content with what he has and who accepts the fact that he inevitably misses very much in life is far better off than one who has much more but who worries about all he may be missing. For we cannot make the best of what we are if our hearts are always divided between what we are and what we are not. We cannot be happy if we expect to live all the time at the highest peak of intensity. Happiness is not a matter of intensity, but of balance and order and rhythm and harmony. Let us, therefore, learn to pass from one imperfect activity to another without worrying too much about what we are missing. When one has too many answers, and when one joins a chorus of others chanting the same slogans, there is, it seems to me, a danger that one is trying to evade the loneliness of a conscience that realizes itself to be in an inescapably evil situation. We are all under judgment. No one of us is free. Not one of us is free from contamination. Our choice is not that of being pure and whole at the mere cost of formulating a just and honest opinion. Mere commitment to a decent program of action does not lift the curse. Our real choice is between being like Job, who knew he was stricken, and Job's friends, who did not know that they were stricken too, though less obviously than he. The fruitfulness of our life depends in large measure on our ability to doubt our own words and to question the value of our own work. The man who completely trusts his own estimate of himself is doomed to sterility. All he asks of any act he performs is that it be his act. If it is performed by him, it must be good. All words spoken by him must be infallible. The car he has just bought is the best for the price, for no other reason than he is the one who has bought it. He seeks no other fruit than this, and therefore he generally gets no other. If we believe ourselves in part, we may be right about ourselves. If we are completely taken in by our own disguise, we cannot help being wrong. What we need is the gift of God, which makes us able to find in ourselves not just ourselves, but Him. And then our nothingness becomes His all. This is not possible without the liberation effected by compunction and humility. It requires not talent, not mere insight, but sorrow, pouring itself out in love and trust. Despair is the absolute extreme of self-love. It is reached when a man deliberately turns his back on all help from anyone else in order to taste the rotten luxury of knowing himself to be lost. In every man there is hidden some root of despair, because in every man is pride that vegetates and springs weeds and rank flowers of self-pity as soon as our own resources fail us. But because our own resources inevitably fail us, we are all more or less subject to discouragement and to despair. Despair is the ultimate development of a pride so great and so stiff-necked that it selects the absolute misery of damnation rather than accept happiness from the hands of God and thereby acknowledge that He is above us and that we are not capable of fulfilling our destiny by ourselves. But the man who is truly humble cannot despair, because in the humble man there is no longer any such thing as self-pity. Only the man who has had to face despair is really convinced that he needs mercy. Those who do not want mercy never seek it. It is better to find God on the threshold of despair than to risk our lives in a complacency that has never felt the need of forgiveness. A life that is without problems may literally be more hopeless than one that always verges on despair. God's more glorified by a man who uses the good things of his life in simplicity and with gratitude than by the nervous asceticism of someone who is agitated by every detail of his self-denial. The former uses good things and thinks of God. The latter is afraid of good things and consequently cannot use them properly. He is terrified by the pleasure God has put in things, and in his terror thinks only of himself. He imagines God has placed all the good things of the world before him like bait in a trap. He worries at all times about his own perfection. He struggles for perfection, becomes a kind of battle. The struggle for perfection becomes a kind of battle of wits with the Creator who made all things good. The very goodness of creatures becomes a threat to the purity of this virtuous one, who would like to abstain from everything. But he cannot. He is human, like the rest of men, and must make use, like them, of food and drink and sleep. Like them, he must see sky and love, in despite of oneself, the light of the sun. Every feeling of pleasure fills him with a sense of guilt. It has besmirched his own adored perfection. Strange that people like this should enter monasteries, which have no other reason for existing than the love of God. When it comes to fighting the deep and unconscious habits of attachment which we can hardly dig up and recognize, all our meditations, self-examinations, resolutions, and planned campaigns may not only be ineffective, but may even sometimes lend assistance to our enemies, because it may easily happen that our resolutions are dictated by the vice we need to get rid of. And so the proud man resolves so fast more, and so the proud man resolves to fast more and punish his flesh more, because he wants to make himself feel like an athlete. His fasts and disciplines are imposed on him by his own vanity, and they strengthen the thing in him that most needs to be killed. Okay, I'm losing my voice, so I'm going to break this section of the book into two parts because there's still quite a bit left. And I've been reading for over 2 hours. So I'll mark this page and I'll make an additional video for part 3. And I'm going to go to bed now because it's technically past my bedtime and I need to get up early and meditate. I want to. Okay, bye guys.